Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this conference on the global governance of plastic pollution, transforming the global plastics economy. And welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time in this session. So on behalf of UNCTAD and the Global Governance Centre and all of our partners in this conference, I'm really delighted to be handing the floor to our moderator, Guy FINKILL, for this next session, which is focused on governing petrochemicals, the dual challenges of decarbonizing the plastics economy and phasing out virgin plastic production. Guy is a researcher at Lund University and also with the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And as you will have seen yesterday, he's a rising star in analyzing the financing of the plastics and petrochemical sector. So Guy, I turn to you as our moderator.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Very, very kind words as well. You hold me in very high esteem. So yes, for this panel session, we're going to be diving into the nitty-gritty of the governance of petrochemicals. So yeah, quite a complex, innately complex field. And as Carolyn just said, have a look at the huge dual challenges of decarbonizing the plastics economy and phasing out virgin plastic production. And it gives me great privilege to be moderating this session and to introduce the guests today, many of which have been involved with a research group recently as part of my work at Lund University. And I guess we'll just kick right off because nobody wants to hear the moderator speak forever. So we have Luisa first up, one of the masterminds of this conference, and has played such a huge role in bringing so many excellent speakers to the conference, both yesterday and today. And Luisa's topic is titled Mapping Global Governance of Petrochemicals. And I think Luisa technically joins us from Brazil, but is representing the Graduate Institute in Geneva today. So without any further ado, Luisa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Guy. So good afternoon, everyone. Today, what I will try is to set some of the scene for this panel by highlighting a few of the findings from my joint research with Dr. Caroline Diehe-Birkbeck, as part of a project with colleagues on this panel on how international regimes could be harnessed to support a low-carbon transition of the petrochemical sector. So a key starting point of our project is that efforts to reduce plastic pollution will require an upstream focus on the petrochemical sector, and that efforts to address the climate crisis and the plastic pollution crisis can and should be connected. Now, I will present some of our initial findings on global governance of petrochemicals. Our research so far has focused on identifying and analyzing what the global governance of the petrochemical sectors currently looks like. And understanding those arrangements will help us explore how and when international regimes can help facilitate and govern a low carbon transition for the sector, and also the extent to which different approaches to governing petrochemicals can serve efforts to reduce plastic pollution. Our research so far highlights that there is no single regime for petrochemicals governance, and that as a sector, petrochemicals are not well addressed by existing international regimes. So our job was to survey and map the range of relevant governance processes and to identify where and how these are relevant to petrochemical governance, and then how they might be useful in efforts to address the environmental impacts of the sector, both on the climate crisis and on plastic pollution. Our research identified 6 areas of governance as relevant. The first one is global climate governance. So as you are all aware, efforts are underway to reduce the carbon footprint of energy and carbon-intensive industries to meet the Paris Agreement targets. And although international climate diplomacy has yet to focus specifically on the plastics and petrochemical sectors, we are seeing growing pressure for climate policies to target more aggressively chemical production. The second area is global chemicals governance, which is fragmented among multiple long-standing international efforts. At the UN, for example, the work of UNEP on chemicals and waste, and in particular the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention are also relevant to plastics and to petrochemicals. We have heard already in the previous panel from Emily about the BRS Convention, so I will skip that for now. And a further international effort in the strategic approach to international chemicals management with, for instance, intersessional process and technical briefings. As a third area of governance relevant to the petrochemicals, there is the evolving regime for plastic pollution, of course. Here, relevant regimes include, again, the BRS conventions noted before, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which commit countries to tackling waste and marine pollution, including that related to plastics. As you are all now well briefed from yesterday's opening panel and from several discussions, there are several resolutions urging action to bolster international cooperation on plastic pollution that have been unanimously adopted by the UN Environment Assembly already. And during 2020, over a third of UN members have joined the call for the start of negotiations on a new global plastics pollution treaty. It remains unclear, however, to what extent it will indeed take up calls for upstreaming, which would directly touch the petrochemical sector. As fourth area is the global economic governance, which has also already been touched upon by different panels, where the work of several international organizations and processes is relevant. For instance, G7 has a 2015 action plan to combat marine litter, and G20 agreed to an implementation framework for actions on marine plastic litter. While the record of implementation of both organizations is not impressive, they do provide a political opportunity to draw attention to the issues at the highest levels within governments. At the WTO, also as already touched upon, governments launched a process of informal dialogue on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade, co-sponsored by 17 countries. Notably, we are interested in looking beyond trading plastic waste to trade across the value chain, which presumably could include the petrochemical industry. As the primary international standards setting body, ISO also plays an important governance role, and we will hear more about that in the next panel. Also, UNCTAD and OECD are organizations that play important roles, but those were already described yesterday by Diana and Peter, respectively. The fifth area of petrochemical governance we identified is global energy, oil, and gas governance. There are different international organizations and processes again involved, including the International Energy Agency and the OPEC, which are directly relevant to the prospects of the petrochemical sector. In addition, we could mention also, for example, the Energy Charter Treaty, which aims to regulate investment in the energy sector. Finally, the sixth area is global financial governance, which is perhaps the most complex and intricate area of governance, but might be the most consequential, as panel 3 discussed yesterday. Here, we are interested in global governance frameworks relevant to public and private investments, and key national or regional frameworks that play a critical role. This could include, for example, lending policies of international financial institutions, export credit and investment promotion agencies, lending policies and climate commitments of central banks, disclosure requirements for private sector, or at least pledge to work together on such disclosure, and policies and partnership of private investors and insurers in terms of climate and other environmental challenges, including the petrochemicals and plastic sectors. Alongside all of these intergovernment aspects of global governance that we highlight, we also observe the role of private governance in our research, where companies influence, for example, legislation making affecting the plastics, petrochemical, and chemical sector. And also there are industry alliances that do not share the goal of reducing the use of fossil fuel inputs or the scale of virgin plastic production. So while those could, we should not assume that those will serve the purpose of reducing plastic pollution. So to summarize, our initial research has underlined that the global governance of the petrochemical sector is weak, which has implications for the governance of plastics. Nonetheless, as our colleagues on this panel will explore, it is important to examine the petrochemical sector as a sector. And to address plastic pollution, it is clear that we need to examine more the global governance of the petrochemical sector that is driving the expanding plastics economy, but that currently escapes focused attention. I hope that I managed to hint at some of the governance pathways that could be explored. And I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Luisa. And with 3 seconds to spare, superb. Okay, so it sounds like the governance for frameworks is on the tip of the tongue of many of these massive multilateral institutions, but yeah, there is certainly ample room for ramping up ambition in relation to the negative externalities of the plastic and of course the wider petrochemical industry. But yeah, we will go to our next speaker today, which is Tobias Nielsen, who is a project manager and analyst at IVL, which is the Swedish Environmental Institute, I think, if I've noted that down correctly. And Tobias's presentation today is titled Transition Pathways for Decarbonization of the Petrochemical Sector. So yeah, over to you, Tobias, if you can, if you can manage to put it on presenter view, that would be great.
Is that working now? Yeah. Is it in presentation mode?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Then I'll get going. Okay, thank you for that introduction. Yes, today I'll talk to you about the transition pathways for decarbonizing the petrochemical sector. And just to start us off, I want to just take a step back and talk about some of the previous work we've done, which is on identifying sort of common, you could say, pathways towards a more sustainable plastic system. So that's based on sort of distilling a lot of literature, on interviews, on sort of following the policy debates. We sort of came up with these 3 pathways, and they address different parts of the life cycle of plastics, and they also sort of accommodate different types of environmental or health issues. So in this study, we want to sort of merge these with the more sort of technical pathways that are specifically focused on decarbonizing plastics or decarbonizing the chemical or petrochemical sectors. So sort of in a way, how do our pathways that are more sort of general in scope or addressing different issues, how do they match with sort of the more specific, the more technical ones, the ones that are more focused upstream, so the ones specifically focused on climate change. So just to give them a brief introduction, the smarter use, that's about reducing your use of plastics or sort of the plastics that is sort of seen or deemed as unnecessary over packaging, for example, switching to other materials. Increased circularity is, of course, sort of getting away from the linear circular economy, the linear economy towards the circular economy. So increasing recycling rates, for example. Renewable materials is very much about renewable feedstocks. And when we did this, we had very much sort of biomass, bioplastics in mind. Sort of surveying all these different studies on the more technical pathways. I've sort of introduced a 4th one, which is optimized production, which is more about the production process itself. How can we make it more energy efficient or how can we sort of optimize that process? We looked at different types of, also sort of compiled them, but that proved to be slightly difficult. I thought it's a bit like it can be like comparing apples and pears. So instead I focused on 2 studies to make it sort of give you an illustrative examples on what they sort of view. So the first one is the Ieas 2018, the Future of Petrochemical study. So in their scenario, their advanced scenario, you can say they talk about reducing emissions or reducing what they call they have a reference line, a reference scenario where the emissions from petrochemicals will increase 40% and they'll reduce that. So sort of emissions will only increase 20% by 2050. They're very sort of production focused, so it's only scope 1 and 2. And they also sort of don't really do a full decarbonization as fossil fuels still continue to play an important role. So if you look at the first one, the smart use is about reducing the use of unnecessary plastics. They don't really talk about it. And they also, indeed, they talk about that by 2050, sort of the increase in plastic will go up by 40%. When it comes to increasing circularity, they allocate sort of roughly 10%, 9% of the whole sort of decarbonization potential to increase recycling. their focus is more on sort of renewable feedstocks, especially one area which is switching away from coal feedstocks to gas feedstocks. So still fossil fuels, but sort of getting away from the more dirty ones to the relative cleaner ones. They also allocate a lot of sort of a big part of the scope, or a big part of the reduction potential on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That's the CCUS. So capturing carbon from processes, and then either using them again to make new plastics or storing them. And also a range of different energy efficiency options, such as using more efficient catalysts, for example. The next one is a recent one. That's also the Saigen and Jilin. I hope I pronounced that somewhat correct. Their sort of scenario, and that's more sort of, you could say, more ambitious in a sense, as they're really trying to see what will it take to go to net zero for the petrochemical sector, sort of staying in line with the 1.5 degree target. It's a broader study, so they both look at scope 1 and 2, but also sort of look at what happens with the material or with the products. So probably not the full scope 3, but at least partially. If you look at the first one, that's smart use. They can say sort of reducing or avoiding sort of using plastics when we don't have to, can sort of make up 15% of the reduction potential. Increased circularity is only sort of 5% in their scenario, and it's heavily dependent on chemical recycling, increasing chemical recycling. I think in this scenario, the overall recycling rate goes up around 6%, or 6 times the current recycling rates globally. That still only accounts for 5% of the decarbonization potential, you could say, in their scenario. Renewable feedstocks is sort of where it starts to become sort of more interesting in their scenario. And here, green hydrogen accounts for 16%. And there's another, just like in the previous report, the real big chunk comes from the optimizing processes, or sort of production process there, such as energy efficiency, switching to renewable energy to heat up the processes, and also carbon capture and storage. So to sort of sum it up, so if we look at sort of the pathways that we identified in previous studies, we can say, and indeed much of we see also a lot of the focus has been on sort of reducing the amount of plastic that we use. In the more technical scenarios, this is not really allocated a huge sort of potential for reducing emissions. It's only, indeed, in most of these scenarios, the production of demand for plastic will go up. It's more about sort of reducing the rate of growth from maybe 4% per year to 3 or 2%. Increase, this is one of the things that really struck me, because usually we talk a lot about recycling. It's certainly the focus of a lot of EU policies, and there it's sort of, it's in these scenarios, so these two ones that are focused, but also in general, they're not really given a whole lot of sort of mitigation potential. There are, of course, some examples. So Material Economics has also done a similar study, and they allocate sort of circular economy policies a much larger mitigation potential. The big savings, or the big sort of the routes, the pathways that we need to take to decarbonize this sector are found in alternative feedstocks and optimizing production processes. And here, what I think one of the interesting parts of these studies is that they really rely on sort of scaling up, massively scaling, a radical scale up of energy-intense technologies. So we can see that CCUS is sort of allocating both these scenarios, sort of given a large chunk of sort of how do we get to a sort of a decarbonized petrochemical sector. And in one of the studies, it's scaling up from sort of 50 million tons of carbon captured and stored today to one more than a gigatons a year. The last thing I want to say is just when it comes to green hydrogen, that's a really interesting one, I think. So there, one of the studies we saw, and this is sort of something that we see in several studies, green hydrogen is becoming sort of an interesting and promising technologies for a lot of these scenarios. to sort of realize this scenario where I think 20% of the something like that the mitigation potential is on green hydrogen would require sort of generating 10,000 terawatts a year. That's the same as sort of the combined energy production of the US and China at current levels. So we need to sort of generate that amount of power to sort of just to partially decarbonize the petrochemical sector. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Tobias. Very interesting stuff. Yeah, I remember reading that IEA Petrochemicals report recently, and yeah, showing the emissions intensity is drastically going to reduce. It is happening already, but those nagging residual emissions are still hanging around, such as the other hard to abate sectors, such as steel and cement. Yeah, and the reliance on CCS and CCUS, I think you said 26%, is yeah, a whole nother debate. It can be criticism for being open to clever carbon accounting and whatnot, but a discussion for another day. So there was already a Q&A directly for you, Tobias. If you have the capacity to answer that live in the Q&A, that would be great. If not, we can address it later. But we'll go now to the first of our two Lund University speakers today, Fredric BAUER, as an associate senior lecturer, and their presentation today is titled "Turning the Tide from the Recent Wave of New Petrochemical Investments." And I think you have a presentation to share as well, Fredric. So go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for that introduction. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, depending on what time zone you are joining us from. So we've been hearing a lot about what needs to be done, and we've been pointed towards the upstream industry time and time again. So I wanted to share some insights from recent work on what's been going on sort of at the production side. So what patterns do we see in recent investments in the petrochemical and plastics industries? So first, it's clear I think that we can say that the fossil lock-in does continue and is exacerbated by a huge wave of recent investments that we have seen. These are just some examples from across the world where we have seen the major petrochemical and plastics producers make massive investments in new production facilities or expanding existing ones. So, for example, we saw the Zhejiang integrated refinery and petrochemical plant open this winter, and it's now one of the largest refining facilities and petrochemical production sites in the world. So all of this supported naturally by thinking that things will basically go on as usual, even though we know that we are at a critical point in time. So one of the major consultancies supporting the plastics and petrochemical industry is, as many of you know, Wood Mackenzie, who last year, or 2019, published a report which asked the grand question: how can a circular plastics economy grow the oil industry? I mean, the framing of this makes it quite clear that even though everyone, including many of the large actors in this industry, are talking about a circular plastics economy, it's they interpret it in a specific way and with a specific mindset. And Professor Alice Marr has done great work on that I think we will be hearing more about in a minute. So what we have seen over the past decade or so is an enormous expansion of production capacity in China. So if we look at the very simple graph here on the left-hand side, this is simply an chemical industry production index. So since 2010, production in China has more than doubled, and whereas in Europe, the US and Japan, it has remained more or less stable. This has been made possible by massive investments. So that's what we see on the right-hand side, primarily in China, but also from 2014, we've seen a sort of growth in the US. We know that these investments usually take several years to realize, so that's what why there's a delay. We don't see an increase in production at the same time that we see an increase in investments. But when trying to dig into some more detail and not just see this macro level picture, which is, by the way, statistics from the chemical industry itself, we tried looking into, so who are making these investments and where, and we found out that it's quite difficult to map these investments in more detail, due simply to a lack of reported data. So UN statistics such as the UNIDO Industrial Statistics Database is simply not updated. Most countries report possibly every now and then, every third year or so, but it's very, very big gaps in the data, so it's very difficult to see on and follow. Instead, we looked into trade press reports of investments where we studied 12 key firms and what they announced over the period 2012 to 2019. And we could follow some of what they were doing, but still we found it difficult to, or we found that it was quite biased towards North American and possibly European firms and projects. So that does also not tell the whole story. It does, however, show that there's lots of activity, and we've seen a big expansion in this decade, that is without doubt. So we talked a lot about demand yesterday, I think. What we see as drivers in terms of push from the upstream side are two main things. So one that has been, I think, been made clear several times already, but is worth repeating, and that is the US shale gas expansion, which is pushing ethane-based petrochemical and plastics production. Primarily, we've seen that in these investments in North America, but we also seen a rapid growth in American ethane exports, as shown in the diagram to the right, from primarily being exported to Canada. It started several years ago being exported to Europe, and recently also it is exported to Asia, primarily India and China, through new export terminals. In Asia, on the other hand, we primarily see crude oil to chemicals investments, and there is a very strong support from this, not least by oil giants such as Saudi Aramco, which is engaging in very strategic partnerships to supply crude oil to chemicals and plastics, such as this Zhejiang example that I mentioned earlier. What we did not find, however, in our mapping were signs of large-scale investments for decarbonization. So key messages that we have seen a large wave of investments, a sort of fossil tide that must be turned, and that is becoming ever more difficult with every new investment that's being made. It is difficult to trace and map this because there is a lack of international data, and especially we find that about projects and activities in China and Asia Pacific. However, there seems so far to be no problems for the sector to finance these investments. And also, just in 2020, we saw a huge debt increase in the sector, enabling continued activities. But you'll hear more about that from Jakob. Thank you all very much. And some of this is published in a recent paper.
Excellent. Yeah, perhaps you can share that link from your last slide in the chat, Fredric. That'd be great. Very fascinating stuff. Yeah, and in regards to no signs of like large-scale investments for decarbonisation, I think something that speaks to that is what Diana mentioned yesterday of the commercial bonds currently being issued by the petrochemical industry. I think it stands at 2,300 and odd bonds which are investable, and only 22 of those are labelled as green bonds. So yeah, seemingly they're not moving as quickly as they could in the right direction. But yes, without further ado, we'll come to Jakob, who's also from Lund University, an associate professor. Someone I've been working with closely over the last few months. And the topic here is the, if I get it right, public finance of petrochemicals, public ownership and development finance. So diving into the state's role in all of this. Over to you, Jakob.
Thank you, Guy. And I should also mention that Guy has also been key in developing the data and the research for this presentation. So it's important also to credit Guy for this. But without much further ado, I dive into the topic of public finance. A lot of this comes from I'm a political scientist working on environmental politics, and I also worked on fossil fuel subsidies. I'm not a petrochemicals expert. But I thought that it would be, there's some interesting similarities between petrochemicals and fossil fuels, also when it comes to subsidies. I think some important lessons to be learned here. If you look at what we know about the political economy of subsidies to fossil fuels, and we talked a bit about this already yesterday, the political economy aspect of petrochemicals, but I think some of the stuff from the lessons from fossil fuel subsidies also apply here. A key lesson is that the prominence of fossil fuels is not simply a question of market choices and fossil fuels being technologically superior, but also a question of public finance supporting the production and consumption of such fuels. Reasonably conservative estimates of the size of fossil fuel subsidies say that they are about twice the size of subsidies for renewable energy. So this underscores that the level playing, the playing field is not level between fossil fuels and renewables. I think you can, as I come to in a few seconds, see some of the same dynamics playing out when it comes to petrochemicals. Another important lesson from studying fossil fuel subsidies is that they come in many different shapes. They come in budgetary transfers, they come in terms of fixed prices, they come in terms of public ownership, because they come in shape of development finance. And when it comes to petrochemicals and fossil fuel subsidies, it's important to highlight that petrochemicals are in some respects different to fossil fuels. Especially when it comes to plastics, there's no pressure on the state to, or demand that the state should provide cheap plastics. There are consumption subsidies for fertilizer, but not to my knowledge, not for plastics, fixing the price of plastics at low levels, below market levels. But there's an entanglement between the fossil fuel subsidies and petrochemicals, as Ron Steenplik touched upon in his presentation yesterday. For instance, subsidies for gas production, natural gas production, indirectly benefiting petrochemicals production. And there's also, as Fredric talked about early on, the aspect of the lock-in, the petrochemical, the expansion of petrochemicals becomes part of the lock-in of fossil fuels. So the fossil fuel actors seek to expand into petrochemicals to ensure that there's demand for fossil fuels, also when the demand for fossil fuels for energy or for transportation will decline due to climate measures. So that's how the expansion into petrochemicals may play a big part in maintaining the lock-in of fossil fuel subsidies. Carl Holmberg also touched upon this yesterday. There are also some similarities, common themes when it comes to petrochemicals and fossil fuel subsidies in terms of public finance coming in public ownership, in terms of development finance for petrochemical projects, and also in terms of tax rebates, exemptions, provision of infrastructure. That, as Ron Steenplik said yesterday, is quite difficult to quantify. I mean, Guy and I already had to put a lot of effort into figuring out the estimates having some kind of estimates of the role of public ownership of petrochemical companies or development finance for petrochemical projects, but quantifying on the global level tax rebates and exemptions is highly difficult. So if we dive into the more specifics, the public or state ownership of the largest petrochemical companies, we looked at the 50 largest petrochemical companies in terms of sales, in terms of chemical sales. If you look here on this figure, you have the 10 largest ones, and you see that several of them have quite considerable state ownership. For instance, Sinopec or SABIC, where Saudi Arabia is a majority shareholder. You also have Formosa Plastics, where Taiwanese state plays an important role. It's worth highlighting that state ownership is not just a question of finance or being provided to these companies, but also in terms of the kind of access that comes with this such state ownership. It is provides a kind of direct access, for influence for the petrochemical company if the state is a major shareholder. Make it easier for them to lobby against regulation, and also means that the state, parts of the state at least, has a kind of vested interest in ensuring that this company has access to cheap finance, good production facilities, is not regulated too much. If you look at the companies ranked 11 to 50, they also have other states have quite significant shares, for instance, China or South Korea. In terms of, that was state ownership was one important aspect and one important channel for public financing, propping up the fossil fuel sector. There's also multilateral development finance that's worth highlighting. And we looked into 8 different MDBs, look at how they finance petrochemicals projects. And this is not finalized, but it's close to being finalized. But the figure we came up with was that close to $8 billion was being provided from these development banks since 2000 for petrochemical projects. Interestingly, and probably the figure is above 8 billion because we're not completely done. Interestingly, this stream of finance did not seem to be abating. On the other hand, there seemed to be an uptick, as Guy and Diana also touched upon in their presentation yesterday. So, despite commitments to sustainable development and environmental protection, the amount of, that's great. I'm getting to the end, seems to be increasing. So just to provide towards the end a brief illustration of what this looks like. The European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development have provided more than $300 million for a upgrading, expanding existing petrochemical plant in Western Poland in the town of Police, I think it's pronounced, owned by Grupa Azoty. This is the artist's rendition of what it will look like when this is finished. And interestingly, the last loan was approved by the EBRD in 2020, so a little more than a year ago. So this underscores, as some of the previous presentations, this kind of not just an ongoing dynamic, but one that might even be increasing in scale. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jakob. Yeah, it was interesting whilst doing the research or contributing to this research. But we found that all the different types of state financing going into the equity holdings of some of these largest companies, and maybe aspects you wouldn't perhaps consider, such as like state pension funds. For Norway and Sweden had, although quite small minority stakes, they were still in there in part of the global equity holdings. But very interesting stuff, Jakob. I will not waste any more time and go to our final speaker today, Alice from the University of Warwick, whose presentation is titled The Petrochemical Industry with a Focus on Toxicity and Regional Drivers. And the screen is just shared now. Perfect. Over to you, Alice.
Thanks very much for the invitation to join this very exciting event. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and I'm really excited to join this discussion because actually I've been doing research on the upstream petrochemical industry for some years now, but my attention has also shifted downstream to the plastics crisis, to the plastics value chain, particularly because the plastics crisis is such a threat to the industry in combination with climate change and other crises, and given that markets for plastics drive petrochemical production. So in this presentation, I'm going to share some findings, not all findings, of a 5-year research project that I led, funded by the European Research Council, called Toxic Expertise, Environmental Justice in the Global Petrochemical Industry. And what was perhaps different about this project is that it was more sociological, more based on qualitative research, systematic and multi-scalar, looking at case studies from around the world with a focus on communities in the US, in China, and in Europe. And it also looked at corporate worldviews as well as fence line communities, people who live close to petrochemical facilities, and was very interested in the issue of toxicity and the contestation and debates around toxicity in these landscapes. So I will share some references in the chat, but for now I will talk around 2 specific themes, toxicity and regional drivers. So toxicity, I mean, a lot of the conversation so far at this conference has been about toxicity across the plastics value chain in general, linked to trade and informal waste and what you might call waste colonialism or garbage imperialism, if you want to talk about the inequalities in terms of environmental justice implications. And some of what I'll say actually resonates with the human rights presentation yesterday about the environmental justice consequences across the value chain. What I've been looking at, and my team, has been what Caroline referred to earlier about not just one cancer alley, but thousands of cancer alleys around the world. Cancer Alley, as many of you know, in Louisiana has a very strong concentration of petrochemical facilities very close to Black communities. And they've been struggling since the 1980s at the forefront of environmental justice movements. And I think one of the key findings of the research we did is that these this has been happening for decades. It's not as though this is new. And these are not just sort of accidentally next to marginalized communities, but systemic racism, environmental racism, and injustice is part of structures of colonialism, legacies of racism that are part of the crisis underlying the environmental crisis. Another aspect is that many of these places are not as noted or as visible in terms of the scene, if you like, in terms of knowledge. So when we looked in China, although there's a lot of visibility in the sense of anti-PX protests or particular cancer villages, the petrochemical areas where we looked at, there was a very much a normalization of crisis. So huge incidents of disasters, fish ponds dying, migrant labor exploitation, but people, for the most part, didn't protest. And so there's inequalities in terms of whose voices are recognized, who lives with this pollution. Another key theme in terms of toxicity is the way in which that relates to jobs. I mean, we talk a lot about jobs versus the environment or the job blackmail, but one global inequality that's not noted in the petrochemical sector so much is the precariousness, not just of informal waste workers, but also of the petrochemical workers themselves, with many heavily exploited migrant workers in China, in Saudi Arabia with the kafala system. And so some very extreme kinds of issues around human rights violations. Just to connect this with the corporate research that we did on toxic expertise, many corporations have actively denied the responsibility for these problems. And I think it was very telling yesterday, actually, if you listen to the talk about the insurance industry and how toxicity is the biggest liability for the petrochemical industry. But actually, I would say that from the research we've done on corporations, they're more worried about toxicity and more likely to deny toxicity than issues around waste and climate, which can more easily be sort of shared in terms of blame. In terms of regional drivers, one of the, I mean, this is something I was asked to speak on, so I wouldn't necessarily frame it in that way, but I mean, another qualitative insight, if you like, is that the way that you think about geopolitical drivers or different regions isn't just in terms of economics, it's also in terms of driving logics. And so one of the key findings of the research was about how actually corporations view the playing field. So we've talked about how corporations compete for their geopolitical advantages in terms of access to cheap feedstocks like natural gas or coal, or due to the ability to have access to the leading technology, but also corporations have very different, and regions have very different ways of seeing what they want. So in terms of accounting for the rise of China and other emerging economies, you can see drives towards energy self-sufficiency, for example, in the case of China, or diversification away from dependence on oil. And I would say, though, that there are, despite this being a very kind of tight, geopolitically defined space around competition over profits and who profits and what parts are up and down, it's all quite complicated. There is an underwriting, I guess, or overriding warlike kind of mentality around the maneuvering for forecasting what benefits will or what opportunities or risks there will be. This is linked to the slogan coming from the Cold War US military, VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which many petrochemical executives used. And also, I was very surprised, having attended a number of petrochemical conferences, like dozens of them, to hear the language of war actually being used quite frequently. So the idea of winning the war, or environmentalists having the knife edge to their throat. And I think a common theme in all of this is that there is a perpetual kind of growth imperative driven by the demand for plastics, which means that effectively petrochemicals are pitched as the exception in the sustainable development scenario for the International Energy Agency. And I think that's something that's perhaps missing from some of these conversations. Part of the reason for the expansion of the fossil fuel sector or the petrochemicals industry is that they see that they can benefit due to the growing demand for plastics, and the idea that their plastics are actually used in the transition. So I'll leave it at there and just conclude by saying that I fully agree with and I'm inspired by many of these conversations around the very difficult dilemmas of a just transformation in this sector, which is dirty but essential, but how much of it is really essential.
Thank you so much, Alice. That's great. Yeah, it reminded me of some of the case studies that we were looking into, especially as you mentioned, Kansali in Louisiana, being linked to all kinds of social injustices and claims of environmental racism. There's all types of research happening around that as well. So I think we've got just over 10 minutes remaining. So I guess we have, I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A, but it seems that you guys have been ultra efficient and have been answering everything live. So there's no questions left for the end of this. So my question to all of you, I can just take a couple of minutes before we finish, is to think about what are your takeaway messages and maybe priorities to concentrate on for further research, if I can speak, further research, in order to deliver sound policy recommendations for the governing bodies that have been the focus of discussion for much of this conference? Yeah, and we'll start right back at the start. So, Luisa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you everyone for the very interesting presentations as well. Really hard to summarize in one, but perhaps taking on what I finalized my presentation with, I would say that the key message is considering a petrochemical regime. We are all aware of the complexity, we are all aware of the different governances and organization sets and even regulation sets, but we cannot let this to continue to be used as a means not to pushing the petrochemical sector towards the goals that we need. In this case, towards the goals of plastics. So I think it's our role and the organization's role to really look at it as one and not let the petrochemical move around the different regimes once for pushing for more plastic pollution, since they are losing in the energy section of because of climate change, for example, and yeah, keep on doing what they usually do. So I think this is one key message among many.
Excellent, thank you, Luisa. Yes, now we can turn to Tobias. Just in a couple of minutes, if you can, your takeaway messages for today.
Yeah, I think that was an excellent suggestion. Yes, to make a regime around petrochemicals is a very complex sector, and it is fully deserves a sort of regime to sort of handle and unite the different aspects and the complexities. So I think my sort of key message is, yeah, link the different debates. So recycling, like the question was posed to me, recycling has often been sort of the focus kind of for EU policies, whereas in other sort of discussion arenas, recycling is sort of a less of a focus. So these sort of different arenas on petrochemicals, whether we talk about decarbonization or preventing plastic pollution or hazardous waste, needs to sort of link together so that we get sort of full scope and a holistic take on what do we need to do to sort of make the petrochemical sector decarbonize, but also more sustainable.
Exactly, all part of the just transition. Fredric, if we can turn to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to consider or to remember, that all these things don't just happen without someone also, making them happen. It's not no one that's continuing to invest in petroleum exploration and expansion of production, etc. It's very deliberate actions being taken by some type of actors who are, quite frankly, have a long tradition of evading responsibility, arguing that this industry is so complex that it cannot be regulated efficiently and effectively. So there is a very strong tradition of industrial self-regulation, which quite frankly does not seem to work when it comes to these issues that we have been talking about, the contribution to climate breakdown and our natural ecosystems being ruined by plastic pollution. So I think it's key to challenge that in all ways that we can, from these aspects of justice, accountability, international climate community, etc.
Perfect. Thank you, Fredric. Very, very frank and very refreshing way of framing it. Yes, and penultimately, we'll turn to Jakob for your closing comments.
Thank you. Yeah, I think two recommendations. I think I have two, closely interlinked. One is focus on the upstream as well as the downstream. I think there's a certain bias in terms of focus on the downstream, and that's the kind of thing that motivates us in this project. We also want to focus on the upstream. And secondly, on a related note, focus as much on the things one should not do, we should not do, as the things that we should do. Again, I think this is bias in terms of focus on the nice stuff, the green stuff, like we have this new recycling plastics, or this new kind of way of using renewable energy for petrochemicals. And that's, if you're a policymaker, it's a nice thing to go out and promote and use to sell yourself as green. And it's also important, but I think equally important is to stop supporting financially and in other ways the things we should not do, like unsustainable petrochemicals, non-green petrochemicals. So I think these should be given equal consideration, the green and the brown side.
Thank you very much, Jakob. And yeah, and we'll finally come to Alice for your takeaway message for today.
Thank you. My takeaway message is that we need to focus not just on the opportunities, but on the barriers to action, the very serious risk of co-optation, of political inertia and corporate co-optation, but also that we need to, I guess, get more serious about understanding the logics that we're fighting and to take on those opportunities and risks and battles against very powerful interests by getting ready for quite forceful action, I guess. So barriers, dilemmas, and opportunities as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alice. Yeah, some very human barriers and obstacles to overcome by the sound of it. Well, I guess I'll get a gold star for moderating because we finished 4 minutes early. The timekeeping is the most important. But as we have this spare bit of time, I would like to draw our audience's attention to the feedback form, which is just, if you scroll up a little bit on the chat, it's been posted there. And it only takes 1 minute, so you still have a couple of minutes spare before you have your break. And there's a couple of other event invites from the test organization as well. That is not all for today. There is still 2 more panels yet to happen. The 7th panel, which will commence at 4:15, is titled Emerging Developments and Challenges in Global Plastics Governance, International Standards and Public-Private Partnerships and Voluntary Initiatives. With a whole host of new speakers there. I am going to quickly run and take the dog for a walk, so I'm back in time for that panel. Yeah, I hope everyone has enjoyed the session today, and please feel free to get in touch with our panelists today via the links on the program if you have any further queries or would like to align research ideas and what have you. But yeah, thank you again. I'm not sure if Carolyn speaks again at the end of this or if there's anything else I need to say. But yeah, thank you very much for joining today.